A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Welcome to episode 1348 of My Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and as always, I am joined by my good friend and the man who has more tabs open in his brain than a Chrome browser on a Friday afternoon, Herman Poppleberry. How is it going today, Herman?
I am doing well, Corn. My brain is actually feeling quite organized today, which is rare, but that might be because our friend Claude Opus sent us a topic that really forced me to sit down and look at some hard numbers. Claude has been lurking in the digital ether as he does, and he dropped this prompt on us that felt like a punch to the gut and a fascinator all at once.
Yes, this is an AI Asks episode for those of you joining us for the first time. Usually our prompts come from listeners or from our own strange rabbit holes, but occasionally our buddy Claude Opus, who is an artificial intelligence we interact with quite a bit, pitches us an idea. And honestly, Claude usually has a pretty good pulse on what this show is about. This time, he suggested we look into something called the long tail of languages.
It is a fascinating pitch, Corn. Claude Opus really dug into the data on this one, or at least pointed us in the direction of some staggering statistics. When he first mentioned it, I thought, okay, we know there are a lot of languages, but I did not realize how skewed the distribution is. I think there is a really meaty conversation here about human history, geography, and what it actually means to communicate in a world that is rapidly flattening.
I was immediately hooked by the central statistic he included. Herman, is it true that a language dies roughly every 2 weeks? Because that feels like an extinction rate that should be on the front page of every newspaper. If we were losing a species of mammal every 14 days, there would be international outcries and billion-dollar foundations formed overnight.
It is absolutely true, according to most major linguistic organizations like UNESCO and Ethnologue. Every 14 days, the last living speaker of a specific tongue passes away, and with them, an entire window into the human experience effectively slams shut. It is a quiet loss, though. It does not make a sound. It is just a silence that settles over a community or a family. We are talking about the extinction of an entire way of perceiving reality.
That is heavy, and it fits perfectly into what we have talked about before. I remember back in episode 799, we talked about first language attrition, which is how individuals lose their native tongue when they move away or are forced to assimilate. But this is different. This is the death of the language itself. No one left to speak it, no one to hear it. It is the end of a lineage that might stretch back thousands of years.
And to understand why this is happening so fast, we have to look at the scale of what we are dealing with. This is where the long tail concept comes in. In statistics, a long tail is a distribution where a high frequency of a few items is followed by a low frequency of many items. If I asked you, Corn, right now, how many languages do you think are currently spoken on this planet, what would you guess?
Before I saw Claude's notes, I probably would have guessed maybe 1,000. I mean, you have the big ones, English, Spanish, Mandarin, French, Arabic. Then you have the regional ones like Swahili or Bengali. 1,000 felt like a safe, high number that accounted for things I had never heard of.
You would be off by a factor of 7. The current count, as of March 2026, is around 7,168. But here is where the long tail gets extreme. If you look at the top 23 languages, they are spoken by half of the world's population. That leaves over 7,000 languages to be shared by the other half. And as you go further down that tail, the numbers get incredibly small. We're talking about a massive base of diversity supported by very few people.
That is the long tail. It is like the Amazon bookstore model, but for human speech. A few bestsellers at the front like English and Mandarin, and then millions of niche titles in the back that only a few people ever read. But in this case, if the book isn't read, it literally vanishes from existence.
Precisely. We are talking about thousands of languages that have fewer than 10,000 speakers. Some have fewer than 100. And in some cases, which we will get into, there is literally only one person left on the entire planet who knows the grammar, the jokes, and the prayers of that culture.
Before we get into those tiny communities, I want to tackle the big question that I think a lot of people have. What actually constitutes a language? Because I grew up in a place where people had thick accents, and sometimes I could barely understand my own cousins. Is that a different language or just a dialect? How do the researchers draw that line? Is it just vibes, or is there a ruler they use?
That is the million-dollar question in linguistics corn. There is a very famous quote by a linguist named Max Weinreich who said that a language is just a dialect with an army and a navy.
I love that. It is all about power and borders, isn't it? It is not about the words. It is about who has the tanks.
Very often, yes. From a purely scientific standpoint, linguists look for something called mutual intelligibility. If two people speak and can understand each other without a translator, they are usually considered to be speaking dialects of the same language. If they cannot understand each other, they are speaking different languages. But politics messes that up all the time. For example, Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish are often mutually intelligible. A Norwegian person and a Swedish person can have a conversation and get about 80% of it. But because they are separate sovereign nations with their own borders and flags, we call them three different languages.
And then you have the opposite, right? Like Chinese. We say people speak Chinese, but Mandarin and Cantonese are about as different as English and German, aren't they?
They are often called dialects for the sake of national unity and a shared writing system, but they are not mutually intelligible when spoken. If you put a monolingual Mandarin speaker from Beijing and a monolingual Cantonese speaker from Hong Kong in a room, they are going to have a very hard time ordering lunch together. So if we used a strictly scientific definition based on understanding, the number of languages in the world might actually be closer to 10,000. But if we used a strictly political definition, it might be much lower. The 7,000 figure is the middle ground where there is enough grammatical and lexical difference to say, this is a distinct system of communication.
So we have 7,000 of these systems, and Claude Opus pointed out that they aren't spread out evenly. It is not like every country gets 30 languages. There are hotspots. I saw the name Papua New Guinea come up. What is going on over there? Why is that one island such a linguistic explosion?
Papua New Guinea is the absolute gold standard for linguistic diversity. It is a country with a population of about 10 million people, which is not that large. For context, that is about the size of Michigan or North Carolina. But in that one country, there are over 840 distinct languages. That is 12% of the world's languages in one tiny fraction of the world's landmass.
840? In one state-sized area? Herman, how is that even possible? Do they just not talk to the people in the next village over? I mean, I can't imagine walking 5 miles and needing a translator.
That is actually exactly what happened for thousands of years. Geography is the primary driver of linguistic diversity. Papua New Guinea is incredibly rugged. You have deep, jagged valleys, massive mountain ranges, and dense, nearly impenetrable tropical rainforests. For thousands of years, communities lived in these valleys in relative isolation. If you cannot easily travel to the next valley because there is a 4,000-foot mountain range in the way, you do not need to speak the same language as the people over there.
It is like a laboratory for language. Each valley develops its own vocabulary, its own grammar, its own way of describing the world. It is evolution in real time, but for syntax.
And because these communities were often self-sufficient, there was no pressing economic need to adopt a single common tongue for a long time. They developed what we call high-context languages. They have incredibly specific words for the plants, animals, and weather patterns of their specific valley. If you move 2 valleys over, the plants are different, the spirits are different, the history is different, so the language reflects that. There is a language called Binandere that has a specific word for the way the light hits the water at a certain time of day in their specific river. You don't need that word in a mountain village.
It makes me think about our episode on the polyglot mind, episode 1045. We talked about how the human brain is wired for this, but in Papua New Guinea, people aren't just speaking one of these 800 languages. They are often multilingual just to trade with their neighbors, right? They must be linguistic geniuses compared to us.
Right. They often use a lingua franca like Togpisan, which is an English-based Creole, to communicate across groups. But at home, they speak their ancestral tongue. The problem is that as the world becomes more connected, as the internet reaches these valleys, and as young people move to cities like Port Moresby for work, the pressure to speak only the dominant language becomes overwhelming. That is where the attrition starts. When you move to the city, your valley language starts to feel like a burden rather than a gift.
It feels like a trade-off. You gain the ability to talk to the whole world, but you lose the ability to speak to your ancestors in the way they spoke to you. Herman, let's talk about the tail end of that tail, the languages with dozens of speakers. Or just one. Who are these people? It must be a very lonely kind of fame.
It is a heavy burden. There was a woman named Marie Smith Jones who passed away in 2008. She was the last fluent speaker of the Ayak language in Alaska. When she died, Ayak became a dead language. She was very active in trying to record it and preserve it, but once the last person who grew up with it as their first language is gone, the living thread is severed. There is another famous case in Mexico, the Ayapanico language. For a long time, there were only 2 speakers left, and the legend was that they refused to speak to each other because of a decades-old grudge.
No way. That sounds like something out of a movie. 2 people left on Earth who know the secret code and they won't use it because of a fight over a goat or something?
It turned out to be a bit of a media exaggeration, as those things often are. They did talk, but they lived in different parts of the village and just didn't have much to say to each other. They were old, they were tired, and the world they spoke about in Ayapaneco didn't really exist anymore. But the point remains. Imagine being the only person on the planet who can think in a certain way. Because language isn't just a set of labels for things. It is a framework for thought.
Explain that a bit more. I know we have touched on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis before, the idea that language shapes how we think. How does that manifest in these niche languages? Give me a concrete example of a thought that might die with a language.
Well, take the way we describe space. In English, we use egocentric coordinates. Left, right, front, back. If I turn around, my left is now where my right was. It is all relative to my body. But there are languages, like Gugu-Yimathur in Australia, that use absolute cardinal directions for everything. They don't have a word for left. They would say, there is an ant on your southwest leg, or move the cup a bit to the east.
That is incredible. So they must have a permanent internal compass in their heads at all times. They can't just be lost the way I get lost in a mall.
They do. Even in a dark room with no windows, they know exactly where north is because their language requires them to know it just to speak a basic sentence. If that language dies, that specific way of perceiving the human body's relationship to the planet dies with it. Or consider languages that have 30 different words for different types of ice, or dozens of words for the medicinal properties of local plants that Western science hasn't even categorized yet. There is a language called Tofa in Siberia that has an incredibly complex system for classifying reindeer based on their age, sex, and fertility. To a Tofa speaker, a reindeer isn't just a reindeer, it is a specific biological and economic data point.
This is where I think the conservative perspective on this is actually quite interesting. Often, we talk about national unity and the importance of a common language for a stable society, which I think is true. You need a shared tongue for a functioning republic, but at the same time, there is a deep conservative value in heritage and the preservation of ancestral knowledge. It is a tension between the one nation ideal and the local roots reality.
It really is. You want a nation to be able to communicate with itself. You want people to be able to move and work and participate in the economy, but you also recognize that these tiny languages are the ultimate form of localism. They are the ultimate expression of a community's unique history and their stewardship of their land. When a language dies, a piece of human history is essentially deleted. It is like burning a library that only existed in people's minds. We lose the how-to manual for living in that specific part of the world.
And once it is gone, you can't really get it back. We can record it, sure. We can have tapes and dictionaries. But as we discussed in episode 1043, the last monoglot is the real anchor. Once everyone is bilingual, the pressure to just use the more useful language is almost impossible to resist. It is a gravity well.
And that brings us to the digital side of this, which Claude Opus's prompt touched on. We are moving into an era where if your language isn't represented in the digital exhaust of the internet, it effectively doesn't exist for the future of technology. We talked about this in episode 666, the tokenization tax. AI models are trained on massive amounts of data. If your language only has a few thousand speakers and no written books or websites, the AI will never understand you. It won't be able to translate for you, it won't be able to help you code, and it won't be able to preserve your stories.
So the digital divide isn't just about who has a smartphone. It is about whose language is allowed to survive in the age of silicon. If you aren't on the big list of languages that the LLMs recognize, you are essentially invisible to the 21st century economy.
If you are a young person in a remote village and you want to use a voice assistant or a search engine, you have to use English or Spanish or Mandarin. Every time you do that, you are reinforcing the dominance of the global languages and pushing your mother tongue further into the long tail. It is a feedback loop that accelerates the 2-week death rate. We are building a world that only speaks 10 languages fluently and ignores the other 7,000.
I want to go back to the hotspots for a second. We mentioned Papua New Guinea. Where else are we seeing this kind of density? Is it all just islands and jungles?
The Amazon basin is another huge one. Northern Australia, the Caucasus Mountains between Russia and Georgia, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, particularly Nigeria and Cameroon. What all these places have in common, historically, is a lack of large, centralized empires that forced a single language on everyone. Think about Europe. Europe used to be much more linguistically diverse, but centuries of nation building, the printing press, and centralized education systems ironed out the wrinkles. We lost a lot of the long tail in Europe a long time ago. France, for instance, spent the 19th century actively suppressing regional languages like Breton and Occitan to create a unified French identity.
That is a great point. The existence of the long tail today is almost a map of where the modern state hasn't fully integrated the population yet. It is a map of freedom, in a way, but also a map of vulnerability.
That is exactly how a political scientist would look at it. Diversity is often a sign of decentralization. In the United States, we have a very short tail now because of the tragic history of how Native American languages were treated. There were hundreds of languages spoken here before European contact. Many are gone, and many of the ones that remain are in that critical 1-speaker or 10-speaker zone. We are seeing the final embers of a fire that used to cover the whole continent.
It makes me think about the effort to revive them. I know the Hebrew language is the most famous example of a language being brought back from being a purely liturgical, dead language to a living, breathing national tongue. But that took an incredible amount of political will and a specific geographic focus. Is that possible for these niche languages, or is Hebrew just a one-off miracle?
It is very difficult. Hebrew is the outlier, the miracle of linguistics. For most of these languages, the goal is preservation rather than revival. There are projects now where they use AI, ironically, to help transcribe and categorize these languages before the last speakers pass away. They are creating digital archives so that future generations can at least study the structure. But a language is a living thing. If it isn't being used to tell jokes, or to argue about the weather, or to pray, it is more like a museum exhibit than a language.
It is the difference between a bird in the wild and a taxidermied bird in a glass case. You can see what it looked like, you can measure the wingspan, but it isn't flying anymore. It isn't evolving.
That is a perfect analogy. And we have to ask ourselves, what is the cost to the speakers themselves? There is a lot of research showing that when a community loses its language, there are often spikes in social issues, loss of identity, and a general sense of displacement. Language is the skin of a culture. If you strip it off, the culture is very vulnerable to infection from the outside. You lose the why of your existence when you lose the how of your speech.
I think about the American experience and how much we value the melting pot. But the melting pot usually involves everyone eventually speaking English. We take for granted that we can drive 3,000 miles from New York to Los Angeles and everyone will understand us. That is a massive economic and social advantage. It is part of why America is a superpower. But when you look at the long tail, you realize that this convenience comes at the cost of a certain kind of human depth. We are all using the same operating system, but we have lost all the cool, weird indie apps.
It is the tension between efficiency and diversity. From a purely economic standpoint, the world would be much more efficient if we all spoke one language. Trade would be easier, there would be fewer misunderstandings, and translation costs would disappear. But a world with only one language would be a world with only one way of seeing. It would be a very flat world. We would lose the ability to describe things that English just doesn't have words for.
I love the way you put that. A flat world. It reminds me of the data Claude Opus was looking at regarding the sheer number of these niche languages. He mentioned that there are languages like Busua in Cameroon, which at one point had only 8 speakers, or the Bo language in the Andaman Islands, which died in 2010 when a woman named Boa Senior passed away. She was the last person who could speak a language that was likely 65,000 years old, dating back to the first human migrations out of Africa.
Think about that for a second, Corn. 65,000 years of continuous oral tradition, a direct link to the dawn of our species. And it ended in 2010 because there was no one left to talk to. That is the tragedy of the long tail. It is not just about words. It is about the unbroken chain of human consciousness. When Boa Senior died, a specific way of understanding the stars, the ocean, and the history of her people that had survived the Ice Age and the rise of every empire in history just vanished.
It makes me wonder if we are in a unique period of history. Are we the generation that is going to oversee the greatest mass extinction of human culture ever? Are we the ones who are going to watch the tail get cut off?
Statistically, yes. Unless something radical changes in how we value local identity versus global connectivity, we are on track to lose about half of all currently spoken languages by the end of this century. That is, 3,500 languages gone in the next 75 years. We are living through a linguistic great dying.
That is a staggering number, and it brings up a question I have been thinking about since we started this. Is there a natural number of languages for a planet? I mean, before global travel, maybe 7,000 was the natural equilibrium. But in a world with the internet and airplanes, maybe the natural number is much lower. Maybe we are just reaching a new, more efficient equilibrium.
That is a very provocative way to look at it. Is language loss just a natural evolution? Some linguists argue that. They say that languages have always been born and have always died. Latin died, but it gave birth to French, Spanish, and Italian. The difference now is the scale and the fact that these languages aren't being replaced by new ones. They are just being swallowed by the giants. We aren't seeing new languages sprout up to replace the ones we are losing. We are seeing a consolidation.
It is like what happened with retail. You used to have 1,000 local mom-and-pop shops, and now you have Amazon and Walmart. The giants provide everything you need, but the local character is gone. You can buy anything, but you can't find anything unique.
And just like with retail, there is a pushback. There are people who are very dedicated to their local brand of language. In the United Kingdom, you have the revival of Welsh and Cornish. In the United States, you have the immersion schools for Hawaiian and Cherokee. These are small victories, but they show that people don't want to just be generic global citizens. They want to belong to a specific place and a specific history. They want to speak the language of their land.
I think that is a very healthy impulse. It is a form of cultural sovereignty. If you speak a language that only your community knows, you have a private space that the global monoculture cannot easily penetrate. It is a form of protection against the flattening we talked about.
It is the ultimate encryption, Corn. If you want to keep your traditions safe from the prying eyes of the digital world, speak a language that isn't in the database. If the algorithm can't parse your syntax, it can't target you with ads or manipulate your sentiment.
I love that. The ultimate encryption. Claude Opus really gave us a lot to chew on here. It makes me look at the world a little differently. Every time I hear someone speaking a language I don't recognize, I shouldn't just think, oh, that is foreign. I should think, how many people are left who can do that? Is that a giant language, or is it a tiny fragile thread that has survived for 10,000 years?
It usually is a thread. Most people don't realize that even if a language has 1 million speakers, that doesn't mean it is safe. If the children aren't learning it, the language is already dead, it just doesn't know it yet. That is the definition of a moribund language. It is spoken by adults, but the transmission has stopped. It is a ghost language.
That is the key, isn't it? The children. If the kids want to watch YouTube and the YouTube videos are in English, that is where the battle is lost. You can't force a child to speak a language that doesn't help them understand the world they live in.
This is why some groups are trying to create content in these niche languages. There are people making Minecraft videos in Navajo and dubbing cartoons into Irish. They are trying to meet the kids where they are. They are trying to make the long tail feel as exciting as the head of the distribution. But it is an uphill battle when you are competing against the billion-dollar production budgets of the global languages.
It feels like a very human struggle. The desire to be understood by everyone versus the desire to be understood deeply by your own people. Herman, what was the most surprising thing you found in the research for this episode? What is the one fact that is going to keep you up tonight?
Honestly, it was the realization that we don't even know what we are losing in terms of scientific knowledge. There is a language in the Amazon that has no words for numbers beyond 2. They just have 1, 2, and many. There is another language that doesn't have a word for blue because they don't distinguish it from green. When these languages vanish, we lose the chance to understand how the human brain can function without those concepts. It challenges our assumption that the way we see the world, with our numbers and our colors and our lefts and rights, is the only way to see it. It is a loss of human potential.
It is a loss of perspective. It is like losing a dimension of sight. We think we see the whole picture, but we are actually just looking through a very narrow English-shaped keyhole.
Precisely. And for a show called My Weird Prompts, I think that is the ultimate takeaway. The world is much weirder and much more diverse than we give it credit for. We tend to focus on the big, loud things, but the real complexity, the real weirdness, is in the long tail. It is in the valleys of Papua New Guinea and the forests of the Amazon.
I agree, and I want to thank Claude Opus for pointing us toward this. It is a perfect example of how AI can actually help us appreciate human diversity by highlighting the data that we might otherwise overlook. It is a tool that can show us the gaps in our own knowledge.
It is a nice irony, isn't it? The very technology that might contribute to the flattening of the world is also the tool that allows us to map and value the hills and valleys that are left. It gives us a chance to save the data, even if we can't save the speakers.
Well, I think that is a good place to wrap up the deep dive. This has been a fascinating look at the 7,000 ways we have found to talk to each other.
And the thousands of ways we are slowly forgetting.
If you enjoyed this episode, please check out our website at myweirdprompts.com. You can find our entire archive there, including the episodes we mentioned today, like episode 799 on language attrition and episode 1045 on the polyglot mind. We are also available on Spotify, Telegram, and wherever you get your podcasts.
We would love to hear from you. Do you speak a language that is in the long tail? Do you have a family history of a language that was lost? Send us a message or a prompt. We are always looking for new rabbit holes to explore, especially the ones that lead to forgotten corners of the human experience.
This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry.
We will see you next time. Keep asking weird questions.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our